Good afternoon, and welcome to the Jewish Policy Center webinar with our guest, Dr. Walid Phares. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC and your host, and happy to be back. I missed you last week, although I know that Lisa Schifrin and our guest, Jonathan Chancer, did a great job. You can hear that one on our website, and I hope you will. Today being Veterans Day, before we get to our program, I want to say something to our veterans, their families, and all those who admire them, to my daughter and son-in-law who are career Army veterans, and to my late father, a veteran of Anzio. At Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, Saratoga, Trenton, and Charleston in the Revolution, they fought the war that created our country. At Cold Harbor, Antietam, the Wilderness, Gettysburg, and Vicksburg, they preserved us a union and made us better. From St. Mihiel, Belleau Wood, and the Meuse-Argonne that gave us our appreciation of the 11th hour of the 11th day. From Guadalcanal, Manila, Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, and the Battle of Eisenhower Ridge in World War II. From Nakton and Masan in Korea. From Operation Chopper to Khe Sanh to the Tet Offensive and Quang Tri in Vietnam. From Karbala to Balat to Baghdad to Fallujah and Anbar in Iraq. And from Mazar-i-Sharif, Kunduz, Kabul, and Tora Bora in Afghanistan, and so many places in between, from Beirut to Somalia, Benghazi, Nairobi, just to name a few. Our troops are our heroes. Veterans Day is their day, and we thank them. And now for our program. The JPC was established in 1985 as a 501c3 organization, providing analysis of both foreign and domestic policies. Our website is jewishpolicycenter.org, and I encourage you to visit. We support a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. We support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them. The JPC supports small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, that was out the window, and energy security, as well as free speech and intellectual diversity. Our guest today is Professor Walid Phares, born and raised in Lebanon, emigrating to the United States in 1990. He holds undergraduate degrees in law, political science, and sociology from St. Joseph University and the Lebanese University in Beirut. Following his undergraduate studies, he practiced law in Beirut for a while, and then obtained a master's degree in international law from the Jean Moulin University Law School in France, and a PhD in international relations and strategic studies from the University of Miami. He's taught at Florida Atlantic University and Florida International University, as well as lecturing at the National Intelligence University and Bay Atlantic in Washington, D.C. Dr. Farris has testified before a wide variety of committees in the United States Congress, including Defense and Homeland Security. He has also briefed and testified before international bodies like the European Parliament and the UN Security Council on matters related to international security and Middle East conflicts. He served as an advisor to the Anti-Terrorism Caucus in the US House, and since 2009 is Co-Secretary General of the Transatlantic Legislative Group on Counterterrorism, a Euro-American caucus. He has served on the advisory board of the Task Force on Future Terrorism at the Department of Homeland Security, as well as on the advisory task force on nuclear terrorism. That, I will tell you, is a frightening thought. He lectures at defense and international security institutions and serves as a consultant on international affairs in the private sector. Two important things before I turn the floor over to him. Dr. Farris has a really terrific article in the fall issue of In Focus magazine, which you can see on our website, and I hope you will. And you can hear him on his YouTube channel, Walid Phares Official, and you should do that as well. And now, Walid Phares, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Shoshana. I appreciate the invitation to address this wonderful circle of friends and people interested in this very sensitive field. I would like to thank you also for publishing my article and praise your center for having been one of the most important platforms to discuss these national security and foreign policy issues for a number of years. I'd like also, as you just mentioned, to wish a happy Veterans Day to all the veterans and their families out there, and maybe some are with us today. I am in Washington, D.C., or in fact in Virginia, suburb of Washington, D.C., and today it will be my pleasure to reflect upon or further on the subject I have addressed in this article. And the article basically focused on the two major threats, not all of the threats, but the two major threats against the United States for decades now, and how the United States was able to address them, to contain them, or in my view, and we could discuss that, failed in doing so over the past months and now years. Let me begin by, since I would like to make those comments first, and then I'll be more than happy to entertain questions and remarks, by giving a quick historic evolution of those two threats. The first threat I identify is the one that unfortunately America experienced on 9/11. It's the jihadi threat. Obviously, it was carried by Al-Qaeda, but Al-Qaeda is nothing but a wing or a movement or a circle within a much wider global movement, which is the jihadist movement. So that's one side of it and its evolution. Then I would like to visit the other threat, which is the Khomeiniist threat, basically emanating from the Iran regime that came to power in 1979. The United States met with both threats, with both dangers over decades now. Obviously, most Americans look at the benchmarks. They look at, for example, 9/11. They look at the fight against the Taliban for the Salafi, Sunni, Jihadi threat. They look at the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut, 1983, coming from the Iranian-backed Islamist or Jihadi Shia movement, and obviously on the incidents in between. So to have a better understanding on a strategic level of how these two threats developed, at times they coordinated, at other times they had different views. They could clash among themselves. I always give the example of when the barbarians invaded Rome, they fought against each other. That's the Goths, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, and all the tribes coming from the north. They fought against each other, but then together they were able to defeat and occupy Rome at one point. So let me begin with the Jihadi Salafi movement, which could be determined or defined as Salafi in terms of ideology, but politically speaking, it has multiple families, multiple ideological families. And where does it come from, and how did it perceive the United States, and why it clashed with it and continued to do so? So basically the story, if we want to summarize it, is that there was, as we all know, a caliphate. There's a long history of the actual real caliphate from 7th century till 19th century, actually till 1924, when the Ottoman Sultanate, which is the last caliphate, collapsed. Now, after that benchmark, there are forces. There were forces in the Arab Muslim world, specifically in the Middle East, which were radical, refused the collapse of the Sultanate or the Caliphate, refused the rise of republics or states emanating from the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and they committed to perform jihad as long as it needs to reestablish the Caliphate. That's what I argued in my book, Future Jihad, from 2005, that was read by many, many people in the defense and national security realm. So the critical point was the collapse of the actual real caliphate and the rise of a jihadi movement that wanted to simply reestablish the caliphate, with all what would that mean in terms of bringing down the modern day governments in the Arab and Muslim world, reestablishing sort of Islamist emirates in their place, and then gather all these emirates into one caliphate and go back to square one. That's really the fastest way you could put it to understand the roots of that movement. So that movement, which I qualify as jihadist, could call it, some call it Islamic radicalism or Islamist, but basically jihadist because it performs or it believes in one specific ideology, Salafi jihadism, had three ideological families. I'm going to go very quickly over that. One, the most efficient, organized, were the Muslim Brotherhood, Ikhwan al-Muslimin, out of Egypt. Second were the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia. And thirdly were the Deobandis in India. Out of those three, there were generations and generations of movements going all the way to 9/11 and beyond. I'll just give examples. The largest umbrella was and continued to be the Muslim Brotherhood. Out of it, a second generation that would include, let's say, the Salvation Islamic Front of Algeria, that would include Hamas, that would include many other Islamist fronts in the region, and would culminate eventually in Al-Qaeda, and post-Al-Qaeda would be ISIS. And now we will see what happened in Afghanistan to see what would be the ultimate evolution. The Wahhabis have a single lineage that did not produce actual organizations. And by the way, Wahhabis are one thing and the Saudis are something else, but they have intersected. That's why there is this connection between the two, because the Wahhabis were the followers of one ideologue, Muhammad Abdul Wahhab, end of 19th century. They had a huge influence in the history of Saudi Arabia, and only recently that the current government of Saudi Arabia, made of reformers, including MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, they have been weakened to a point where basically Saudi Arabia is re-emerging away from Wahhabism, but story is not over. From Wahhabism came a line straight to Al-Qaeda as well. So Al-Qaeda is on both sides of this school. And quickly, the Deobandis out of northern India are the ideological ancestors of what will become the Taliban decades and decades later. What connects all of those movements as a global jihadi is their will and their intention and their efforts to bring down governments across the Arab and Muslim world, and specifically in the Middle East, and instead reestablishing the caliphate. So short of a reform, a deep reform that will take place in these countries that would isolate the jihadists, Sunni jihadists, we're going to continue to see, on the one hand, a growth of these movements, second, a continuous attempt from Libya to Iraq to Syria to Afghanistan, and obviously beyond that, to reestablish these Islamist entities or emirates. Now, the clash with the United States, that's the bottom line of my talk today, between the jihadist movement and the United States. It's ironic and sarcastic even to think that they have a strategy and they abide by long-term strategies. For example, during the Cold War, the Muslim Brotherhood and the other jihadists considered the United States as a power with whom or which they can work together, not on the long-term civilizational term, but just to defeat the Soviet Union. And I argued in some of my books that this is very important to understand, to see how do they move on the long term. The argument was made actually on Al Jazeera several years ago, that the jihadists were more afraid of the Soviet Union than the United States, though maybe power-wise during the Cold War they were equal. And there were several rational reasons. One is that the Soviet Union was considered as atheists versus their Islamist religious ideology. Second is that the Soviet Union was occupying more Muslim land and closer to more Muslim land, quote unquote, than the far away United States. And thirdly, probably the most important, is that the appeal of the progressive, quote unquote, communists and revolutionary movements backed by the Soviet Union was more competitive with the appeal than the appeal of the Islamist movements during those years, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. People who lived or who studied on campuses in the Middle East were not really attracted to the Islamist ideology. They railed them. I lived a piece of that in Beirut, versus they hailed the left wing and the Che Guevara tradition, so on and so forth. Plus also the social liberation that the Marxists promised, everything in terms of, I promise a house, I promise a car, sexual liberation, all of that was part of the progressive agenda. versus the Islamists and the jihadists in particular, the Salafi, who promised nothing on this earth, who said, you're going to die and sacrifice, and on the other side, meaning in heaven, you will obtain the everything else, the virgins, the honey and milk, and so on and so forth. This is just to illustrate. So they were not winning against the progressives. Therefore, and that's, I'm quoting here Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi, who's the ideological head, if you want, of the Muslim Brotherhood worldwide, said, first, we'll bring down the Soviet Union. So that's why many in the West did not understand why the jihadists were closer to the US, like in the movie Rambo in Afghanistan. Most of these mujahideen became Taliban later, was because of a choice made by their strategic leadership. The Soviet Union collapsed, and then automatically overnight, almost overnight, the jihadists, the hardcore among them at least, who became Al-Qaeda, who came from the Brotherhood, considered that the United States now is the next enemy. They were going by elimination. Soviet Union is down, and now we're going to go against the United States because it's backing most of these Arab regimes that are blocking the jihadists from achieving their goals. And that was even explained by Osama bin Laden in his speeches and his interviews. So the war between the jihadists and the United States is not just a folkloric war based on the Americans are infidels, we are not, and therefore we go after them. No, they were working with the infidels for a while before they decided now we have to bring down the United States. And bringing down the United States is, first of all, to remove it from the Middle East. That was the appeal of Al-Qaeda in the 1990s and the attacks against the United States. First in 1993, New York, then declaration of war in 1996, second declaration of war in 1998, attacks against the two embassies in East Africa, many other conspiracies, the call in 2000, and of course, culminating with 2001. Let me, before jumping to the Iranian side, mention that there was also a split within the Jihadi Sunni network worldwide between those who wanted very early on, in the early 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, they wanted to take the action against the United States homeland. They wanted to take action directly in a confrontation with the US versus the other camp, which was more objective in the sense that they argued for taking over in the Middle East first, and then they will take care of America. And as you can hear me, I'm oversimplifying here. And that was a result of a big conference that took place in Khartoum, 1992, gathered by Turabi, one of the leaders of the Jihadi movement in Khartoum. He passed away since. Between the two camps, Al-Qaeda type, known as Takfiris, that will also be the type of, say, ISIS and Boko Haram, and compare them to the Maoists or the Trotskyists in the Marxist-Leninist or communist movement in the 20th century, versus the state jihadists, that would be the comparison, if you want, with the Stalinists. So those two movements competed among themselves. One, Al-Qaeda type, wanted to engage the United States, arguing that if we hit, they call it the head of the snake, and it falls or it goes or it retreats, then all the tails, they call them the tails, these Arab regimes will collapse. That was their view. Versus the other ones who argue that the Muslim Brotherhood, basically, theory. We're all going towards the caliphate. We need to be smart. We need not to engage a force that could destroy us before we get to the caliphate. So that's why the Muslim Brotherhood school of thinking argues that we need to penetrate the West. We need to mollify the West, and specifically the United States. So we witnessed years and years of influence coming from the Middle East, which started decades before, but after the Cold War, we saw more of it, by Muslim Brotherhood influence, starting with the weakest points that we have, which is our educational system. There is no physical battlefield, it's a war of ideas. So we saw all these movements by the Brotherhood and by their funders in the Middle East to seize influence. And that was successful in the United States because there is the formation of a large influence group, some call it lobby, but it's much larger than a lobby, that was able to determine in the mainstream thinking of the United States a vision of the Islamists that is different than reality, which is that the Islamists are, argues the Brotherhood, a force of progress and change. And I'm going very fast, but I'll be happy to discuss this. We've seen it very clearly as of 2011 during the Arab Spring. During the Arab Spring, did you notice or remember that coming out of the mainstream media, New York Times, Washington Post, bureaucrats at the State Departments, academia for sure, calling the Muslim Brotherhood militias revolutionary? These are the Thuwar, the revolutionary, versus Gaddafi, versus Assad, versus all of these dictators or heads of states, as was the case in Egypt. So that was the ultimate division between, on the one hand, the Muslim Brotherhood strategies, and on the other hand, the jihadists. So to conclude here, and we're going to get to Afghanistan in a second, America was facing two jihadi Salafi threats, very different. It's almost disorienting. One is coming head on with the jihadist movement and all the history of what they did overseas, and of course what they have tried to achieve in country, all these attacks during, let's say, 2006 all the way to a few years ago on the homeland, all these various attacks in various states. On the one hand. On the other hand, the Brotherhood movement, which goal is really not military, but the goal is basically to seize influence and to direct US foreign policy. Now, I will end it in Afghanistan. Afghanistan was actually the largest, most decisive battlefield against this whole strain of jihadi Salafists, more so than Iraq. Obviously, ISIS in Syria and Iraq came after Afghanistan. It was a wave that continues to be, that is challenging the order in the Middle East, and it forced us to intervene even after the withdrawal from Iraq, which I would be very happy to discuss. But Afghanistan's raison d'etre, the essence of Afghanistan, is to bring down the Taliban, is to deny the Taliban the ability to gather other jihadists, including Al-Qaeda, and now obviously ISIS and others, from forming launching pads that would take action against the West in general, America in particular. So if you look at the ballistics of our confrontation with the jihadists, they hit us hard on 9/11. That's what created the trigger to bring America to war against the jihadists openly in Afghanistan. 20 years of occupation. That's my own assessment. The Taliban were not able to get rid of American forces. So we kinetically won the war against the Taliban. But there was one aspect of the war that we actually lost, we mean the United States, which is the war of ideas. Because the challenge was to transform that society, or to give it the opportunity to transform itself. The parallel with Japan and Germany is not really 100% there, because Japan and Germany had references in their past that would allow them to change from Nazism and fascism. But some tried to make the case that we go into Afghanistan, we had to, brought down the Taliban, and the only other thing we can do, the options were we withdraw immediately, the Taliban would have taken it again. We stay there, we try to give a chance for social change. And that's my point here. We failed in conducting the support measure for a change. I don't want to even call it democratic change, because that takes a long time, but anti-jihadist change. And I point to the 8 years of the Obama administration, which was looking at the Brotherhood and the Islamists as a potential partner against the more extreme, let me say it. And we can also talk about it. I don't want to jam everything in one remark. But because in my view, in my humble view, we won militarily, we lost ideologically in Afghanistan. And of course, the way we withdrew from Afghanistan now offered the Taliban not just to go back to square one. They are now much stronger and more powerful in Afghanistan than they have ever been since 1996 when they came to power. The weapons that they have now in their hands, the fact that they are more trained for a guerrilla 20 years. And thirdly, because of the recognition. I would admit, I mean, if we lost the battle in Afghanistan, we lost the battle, that's it. But in Afghanistan, power was transferred to the Taliban. So to close on this, I think in the war with the jihadists, the US won on several battlefields, put a lot of efforts, including everything we've done here in terms of engagement and worldwide strategic communications. I mean, there was no limit to whatever we spent on this matter, but it was now botched, in my view, at least in one place in Afghanistan, that is going to give a lot of hope for the other jihadists everywhere else in the region. Let me move quickly, if I'm good on time, to the Iranian side. So we have one wing that is Salafi, Sunni, Jihadi. We try to summarize the best we can. Now let me move to the second wing. In my books, in the article, I call both wings jihadists. They actually call themselves jihadists. One is more Salafi, Sunni, and the other one is Khomeinist, meaning extremist among the Shia. We would put a lot of time to talk about the history of the rise of Khomeinism that brought down the Shah and then established the Islamic Republic. But assuming that the participants here have a good idea about how that happened, let me say that the goal of the Islamic Republic of Iran is to actually replicate the same republic, one or primo, in every country where there is a large Shia base. They know they cannot do it in Sunni environment. They will clash with them. So that already would tell us, as of 1979 or 80, where is that Iran regime expansion going? I actually wrote a book when I was living in Beirut about the expansion of the Islamic Republic of Iran, published in 1987. Still have it. It's in Arabic. I never translated it. It's simple. It's first of all next door in Iraq, because Iraq has a slight majority of Shia. And then it's in Syria, because the regime in Syria since 1970 is controlled by Alawi community, which is close theologically to the Shia. It's Lebanon, because of the existence of a large Shia community. But when I say Shia, there has always been historically a clash within the Shia community between the more fundamentalists that would espouse later the theories of Khomeini, Shia fundamentalists. And even before the Khomeini phenomenon in Iraq, there was a party, Islamic Liberation Party, Hizb al-Tahrir al-Islami in Iraq, and Hizb al-Dawa as well. So they actually preceded the Islamic Revolution of Iran. So without going into details, I would say that Iran course towards the control of that large space in the Middle East was predictable. First, they targeted Iraq. Before that, they had built an alliance with Syria. And through Syria, they came to Lebanon. They, of course, later on penetrated the Gulf to get to the Shia concentration demographies. One is Eastern Arabia, in Al-Ihsa. There is a whole area where Shia are a majority. Two is Bahrain, but three, as we all know now, for 10 years, it's the Houthis, the Houthi community, who are actually also Shia Arabs. And there are Shia communities around the region and worldwide where the Iranians are very active, including in Pakistan, for example. And they have been trying to spread their ideology, Khomeinism, into Africa, which is something very new. So the Iranian threat against the United States started from day one. It started ideologically. Imam Khomeini himself said that we are facing not one Satan, but two. The red one are the Soviet Union, and the big one is the United States. And there is a small Satan they call Israel. So that's why in their slogans, the famous, infamous slogans, Al-Mautu li-America, death to America, Mautu li-Israel, death to Israel, are still used by followers of the Khomeinists movement since decades. Now, Iran established an Islamic Republic, and on day one, with the first hostage crisis with the United States, that's on arrival, they clashed with the United States. Then they clashed with the US in Lebanon through Hezbollah that they have formed as of 1980-81. They seized American hostages in Lebanon for 10 years. They were released only after a decade. And then they met us everywhere in the Middle East. We were on a race with them. So give you an example. When the US, the Bush administration decided in end of 2002, by then, to invade Iraq, depose Saddam Hussein, already Iran and Assad have planned for a takeover of Iraq by, let me put it the simplest way. They would encourage the United States to take down Saddam Hussein, and then they will take down the US role in Iraq and seize Iraq and connect between Syria, Iraq, and Iran. I had predicted this actually in an article, in an academic article in Global Geopolitics, Journal of Global Geopolitics in 1992. Said, pay attention. Yes, there is a Saddam and there is the Ba'ath there, but what Assad and Khomeini wants is to come from both sides, from the east and the west, and seize Iraq and seize Baghdad all the way to Basra. These are projections in geopolitics that are done regardless of the daily politics. And indeed, it took maybe what, a decade? It did happen. It did happen. And it took 8 years till the Obama withdrawal of 2011 or end of early 2012, that effectively the Shia pro-Iran Khomeinist militias deployed in Iraq. So geopolitically, what did Iran achieve? It achieved the revolution at home, the establishment of the Islamic Republic, the weaponization of the Islamic Republic against the United States and the other Arab countries, and of course, Israel. It achieved a strategic relationship with Syria under the Assad regime. And from Syria, so Iranian Revolutionary Guards landed in Syria, and Syria had occupied part of Lebanon in the civil war, which is not really a civil war, it was a war, where Syria was in and Israel came in for a little while. And through the Syrian regime, the Iranian Pasdaran, Iranian Revolutionary Guards, penetrated Lebanon, connected with the radical elements in the Bekaa Valley, and the rest is history as we know it, formed Hezbollah, and Hezbollah seized most of the areas of the Shia in Lebanon. Actually, when Israel withdrew from Lebanon gradually between 1985 and 1990 first, Hezbollah replaced them, not the Lebanese army. It's a fascinating story, dramatic story. And then obviously when Israel withdrew in 2000, actually the year 2000, May 2000 from the south, from a security zone, Hezbollah took over. So if we begin by looking at Lebanon as one of the theaters of Iranian activities, Hezbollah has been since 2000 in full control of Lebanon, in full control of Lebanon. It controls the ground with its militias. It copies the Iranian Pasdaran system. In Iran, you have the Iranian army, and then you have the militia. The militia is stronger than the Iranian army. In Lebanon, Hezbollah is almost as strong as the Lebanese army, but it has the control of security. They could arrest anybody they want. They could engage in a fight against Israel. Nobody will check with them. So Lebanon is under the control of Hezbollah. In Syria, until the revolution, Assad was in control of Syria in alliance with the Iranians. And finally, as of the end of 2011, as I just mentioned, the Iranians took the control of Iraq with probably the exception of Kurdistan and the north. But they took the control of all the Shia areas and maintained a presence even in Sunni areas where they don't feel comfortable. And let me add one interesting thing, because we may encounter it in the future. The Sunni areas of Iraq have always been anti-Iraq. We know that. Some of them were penetrated by the fundamentalists and jihadists. And this is how the premature withdrawal by the Obama administration from Iraq without and before empowering first the Kurds seriously, and then second, the Sunni moderate elements in coordination with the Arab moderates in the region, that movement led to the rise of Daesh, of ISIS in 2014. And we had Daesh from 14 till recently wreaking havoc across the area and now showing up in Afghanistan because of that decision to withdraw before we make sure that what we have behind us is an ally. And I could discuss that as well when we come to the question. So in a sum, the Iranian threat against the United States is more geopolitical, because at this point in time, they are also racing towards obtaining a nuclear device, a nuclear weapon. They have been, since about 15 years, working on the actual weapon that is an indication that they are heading towards the nuclear arming system, which are the missiles. I warned about it. Many of my colleagues and experts, both here in the United States, in Israel, and in the Arab world, have warned the public and the administrations in America and the governments in Europe that really what indicates the intention of the Iranian regime is the fact that they are building those huge numbers of ramps and ballistic missiles. And by the way, they use them through the Houthis of Yemen against Saudi Arabia and one time against the US Navy. So the missiles are basically what is the most dangerous against the security of the region. And eventually, and I know I'm going very fast here, but I'm serving all the points. If there is no change in Iran, Iran will coordinate with larger countries, allies, one of which is Venezuela. So not to discount Iranian missiles deployed one day in Venezuela. Iran is basically deploying those missiles outside Iran. Yemen is one example. Iraq is another example. Syria and Lebanon and Israel is dealing with as much as it can in Syria, at least. But eventually those missiles will become really intercontinental. The last phase of obtaining a nuclear weapon will be only after Iran would have developed its super missile force. Let me take an example that you may be familiar with. So the Israelis have this very powerful shield that they have against the rockets coming, the dome, right? The rockets coming from Gaza and eventually from Lebanon. The Iranians are building an Iran dome, but with regard to the whole region. And what would that mean is that they need to assert their power in Iraq and of course in Syria and Lebanon and Yemen, equip their militias. So the calculation of Israelis or Americans with regard to Iran is not that the threat will be coming only from Iran. Those missiles and those power centers will be deployed across the region. The Saudis are feeling the heat. The Israelis are feeling the heat. Kurds most recently have been also shelled by the Iranians. So let's bring everything back into a, the conclusion, the general conclusion, which is that the United States, various administrations deployed or designed different policies. I call them the zigzags. We went from one posture under the Bush administration. I'm calculating after 2001, after 9/11, but one can go back to the 90s. And actually it is academically better to take a look at those strategies during the 90s, though the official war on terror started after 9/11. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had a couple of years from the Bush first administration, which after the campaign against Saddam Hussein did not press on Iran. Fact. Second, you had the Clinton administration, which basically disengaged from both confronting Al-Qaeda, there were hesitations, or seriously containing Iran. it allowed what happened in Lebanon. It allowed, what happened with the Iranians in the region. Then came 9/11, change of direction under the Bush administration, went on the offensive against both threats, obviously against Al-Qaeda and all the way to Afghanistan, Department of Homeland Security. So we actually confronted the jihadists the best they could at the time. Where we failed under the Bush administration, in my view, was the war of ideas. Even the Bush administration, with all the criticism that came against it from many quarters, neocons and what have you, they faced off with the jihadists. They put efforts. Problem was in the Bush bureaucracy, actually all the American bureaucracies, they were not on board to expose jihadism. That was the key issue. Then came the Obama administration, that changed course in the different direction. Number one, it wanted to partner with the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamists in general in Egypt and Asia, elsewhere. That's one. And I call it the major change of June 2009, when President Obama went to Egypt and actually spoke directly to the Brotherhood through Cairo University. And that took 8 years of an American effort against the Islamist ideology, 8 years in the bureaucracies. Then the second problem was the push to get to a deal with Iran, which also started through the letters, to a letter or two letters sent by President Obama then to Ayatollah Khamenei. And that was the genesis of negotiations and steps on the ground leading to the Iran deal in 2015. So if you look at this chunk of 8 years, it actually lost the US almost a decade of effort and redirected them in a different direction. For example, the withdrawal, the premature withdrawal from Iraq by the Obama administration was in fact, not because we were long. I mean, everybody talks about long war, but there's always a reason. Because the Iranians said, you want us to get to a deal, get out of Iraq. So to preserve or to get to the deal, which was theorized by the ideologues around the Obama administration, that would stabilize the region. A deal with the Brotherhood would stabilize our role with the Sunni. A deal with Iran would stabilize our role with the Shia. That was the idea. And they were not shy about it in the academic world. So basically, the Iranian efforts to entice the Obama administration to come and negotiate and get to that deal in 2015 was to get out of Iraq. And I'm afraid that our withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was negotiated where? In Qatar, the umbrella for the Muslim Brotherhood, would eventually force us to be in a very difficult situation. But that we could discuss later. So the 8 years of the Obama administration took the country in a different direction. So we did not fight those two threats. They were growing. Came the Trump administration. The Trump administration was too short in time. It was opposed in a way I have not seen, you have not seen, in the previous 25 years or so, from the inside, the brutal domestic politics of the US under the Trump administration by the opposition. Now, the opposition, may I hint, wanted the return to the Iran deal, wanted the return to the cooperation with the Muslim Brotherhood. So there was, in addition to the domestic issues that the opposition had against the Trump administration, there were foreign policy matters. So if you remove the Trump administration, you can go back to the Iran deal, you can go back to a deal with the Taliban. If you look at the events from a historian's perspective, you may understand them even better in foreign policy. So the 4 years of the Trump administration, a different direction, removing the US from the confrontation, removing the US actually from the Iran deal, which was achieved by the Obama administration. And that made the Iran lobby go nuts. That's why they put all their effort to end this policy, probably by ending the administration. And of course, the crushing of ISIS, complete crushing of ISIS, and then forming an Arab coalition with Sunnis who are anti-jihadists. And last but not least, I mean, the dessert was the launch and formation of an Abraham Accord, which is an alliance, in fact, between Arab Sunni moderates that we were able to gather in one alliance and the state of Israel. And that has led not just peace, it has led to an alliance. So the achievements of those 4 years were cut short when the administration lost the elections or left the White House, basically. And now there is a return in this year of the Obama policy, but adapted to the Biden administration. And within months, ladies and gentlemen, there is a trend in Vienna to go back to the Iran deal. And I think they're going to go back to the Iran deal. And of course, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was the long-term goal of the Obama administration for 8 years, it was achieved this year by the Biden administration. So I'm gonna stop here, and then I'll be more than happy to answer any of your questions. I know that I have missed a million one, but I tried to put in hundreds of little arguments.
Actually, Wally, you have answered most of the questions that we got here, but I'm going to push a few questions together for you from people who have been listening. To begin with, was it wrong for the United States in the very beginning to support the Taliban? Was that a mistake against the Russians? And that's coupled with a couple of other questions. First of all, what you think we will now see, because we went from Taliban in control to Taliban out of control to Taliban back into control. What are they going to be doing next? And third question, one of our listeners believes that the Taliban is actually weakened because they now have to run the country. And how much is that going to get in the way of their revolutionary project? So if you could
wonderful, powerful questions. Yeah. So Cold War, I expanded on this matter in my book, Future Jihad. Recommend that those who have not read it, read it. I don't know how to answer, because if you would have asked me and I was alive during the Cold War, what is the priority that the West should have, West and their allies, it's really to defeat the Soviet Union, because if you don't defeat the Soviet Union, it is marching, it is taking over. It is, I mean, it was in Cuba establishing missiles against our national security. So from a Cold War perspective, the priority was to bring down the Soviet Union, and Afghanistan was a battlefield. Now, even then, I was Beirut at the time, obviously. We warned, not me, my brother, because I was too young at the time in his writings, that while you are pushing against the Soviet Union, don't create another threat at the same time. So what would that leave us with? At the time, the Afghan rebels used to call themselves Mujahideen. Now, Mujahideen is non-jihadists and jihadists. Among the Mujahideens, guess who were there? The Northern Alliance. The ones who are now resisting the Taliban in the Panjshir Valley, like the son of Ahmad Shah Massoud and all that. So yes, their name Mujahideen could be confused with jihadists, Arabic, but in fact they were different. So the Taliban were part of the Mujahideen, those who became the Taliban. They had different names, but they were not all the Mujahideen. So I would have recommended, had I been a national security advisor at the time, that the CIA and all the tools that we use, and even our Arab allies, because they helped us in this, would only concentrate on the non-jihadist element of the Mujahideen while fighting the Soviets, number one. Number two, not to quit Afghanistan when the Soviets were defeated, just support the moderates versus the others, which we have not done. And thirdly, move forward to support, in a war of ideas, the secular element, the tribal element, civil society element. It's asking too much in my view, but this is theoretically what we should have done, even though that we were not able to do. That's with regard Afghanistan. Now, what the Taliban plan is very clear and very simple in my view. First of all, they want to eliminate any potential enemy they have in Afghanistan. They're taking their time. We shifted news and media attention right now. We're back to our domestic stuff, and the Taliban are eliminating journalists, professors, women activists. Obviously, they went after the intelligence service that we have formed for 20 years. I've met with many of the officers here in the United States, those who served in the Afghan army. Everything that we could use later in stopping them or working with us, because that's a possibility, they are preemptively eliminating right now. That's what's happening right now. They will take probably a year and a half to finish the job. Number two, they're going to seize all the borders and then use them as passages. Number three, that I can see, they're already hosting and welcoming international jihadi elements. The entire leadership of Al-Qaeda is almost there. They came from Pakistan, some came from Iran. They are reorganizing. Other jihadists as well. I mean, other groups around the world. And unfortunately, because of our inattention to what's happening, many events are taking place. We are learning about it from the Arab media or from Arab intelligence sources. Or of course, Israel has an input into this. So they are restructuring and organizing the international jihadi network, which is going to be the Al-Qaeda on steroids. And they have a systematic program. They're going to go after Tajikistan. They have jihadists inside Tajikistan. Then the other stands in the region. Now they are moving to rehabilitate the Taliban in Pakistan. I could go on for the whole hour, but there is a huge movement to reorganize themselves. They've learned from their strategic mistakes. They are going to be targeting the Gulf, the Arab coalition, the Saudis in Yemen, the UAE definitely, so on and so forth. So it's not that the Taliban took over and they are, playing in those Luna parks and parks as CNN shows us. CNN shows us the fun stuff that is happening. No, they are serious and they are using, of course, now rehabilitating the weapons that they have obtained. They're going to sell some of them. They've sold a few of them, so on and so forth. So unlike the vision that says the Taliban are just sitting there, they're not sitting, they are working. They have advisors from the countries and regimes and organizations that sponsors them. That's also another worry that we have. Now, the last question, yes, I've heard many, even my good colleagues, saying that now that the Taliban becomes the government, they're going to have to deal with those problems. There's one little difference. They don't care about their image. They don't care if the mail system is not working or not enough food, not enough water. If women are harassed, they are the ones harassing them. So this is a force that is as brutal as the Khmer Rouge. All what they care is power, and that's why their violence is what should warn us. For example, in different cases of national liberation movements, yes, they will fight, they will get the colonial force out, and then they have a problem with being in government, and they would lose the elections. Lose what? The elections. Taliban have no elections to lose. So it's going to be a brutal control force. There will be resistance against it, but the one difference, and I conclude here, if the international community, forget it international, if the West will not support the resistance against the Taliban will rule for a long period of time and will cause a lot of problems. And my real concern is the Taliban eyeing the nuclear power or the nuclear weapons of Pakistan. That's even more dangerous than Iran, because Iran still plays the Soviet game of mutual assured destructions, and they do calculate, and yet Israel is very nervous, and we should be nervous. But if the Taliban get access to anything like this in Pakistan, then we have a serious, serious problem.
So we're running a little bit late because we started late, but our people are still here and they're still asking questions. Good. So let me give you one more, and if you could do this one fairly quickly, we'll let people go have lunch. You talked about two threads of threat. One is the Iranian-sponsored threat, and the other is the Sunni jihadist threat. But most of us know that these guys come together when it suits them to do various things. So the question is asked, what is the connection between Iran and the government now in Kabul? Are they talking to each other? Are they working together? What's going on in Kabul?
Let me go back 1 inch and say quickly that the body, the Islamist jihadi body that basically connects between the jihadists in general, Sunni, and Iran are the Muslim Brotherhood. In fact, Qatar. But the Muslim Brotherhood are experts at guiding all Islamists, and they explain it to their base. All right, me and my brother, we are against our cousin, but we and our cousin are against the enemy. That's a well-known saying in the Middle East. Even Israelis use it sometimes. So the Brotherhood are arguing that the most imminent danger against the comeback of the caliphate are the infidels, that would be the United States, Israel, the Arab government, minorities, the Iranian opposition. So what we need to do is accept a convergence. We don't need to work together, but we need to convert and coordinate together against the West with the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime has a similar logic. They, of course, do not like, they dislike actually the Salafists. They have clashed with them, but they have the same opinion. First, we work together as Muslim world, quote unquote, which means the Islamists on both sides. We get rid of the United States, Israel, and everything else, and then we'll see how we're going to settle our issues. So you have a point. There is a coordination. The Taliban, who were, I consider them as wild jihadists before the return, because they spent 20 years in Qatar. So their leadership has been mostly influenced now by the Muslim Brotherhood thinking rather than the wild Al-Qaeda Sudan type of thinking. So to make it very short, the Taliban will accept the guidance of the Muslim Brotherhood in not clashing with Iran before getting rid of the other enemies first. So in many, even our defense analysts spoke to me, oh, the Taliban and Iran are going to destroy each other. And that was a great idea to get out so they could fight against each other. They are not third graders. They know exactly. The Taliban are not going to destroy themselves. The Iranians are not going to wage another war to their east. But they will coordinate as much as they can. They may have some clashes as to what is the line, the dividing line between those two, but they would coexist in my view.
So we're going to end here. And people who listen to this program know that I like to have a positive ending to every program. I'm sorry to say, Walid Phares, you haven't given us one. Do you have something positive to say as we close out here in terms of what the United States can do and how the United States can help its friends around the world not get sucked into this maelstrom between the Taliban and the Iranian Islamists and the Pakistani Taliban? What do we do next that works?
Well, on a good note, may I say, because I don't want to serve good, yes, basically is that we have good news coming from the region. Thanks to the Abraham Accord on the one hand, that showed that Israelis and UAE and Arabs could work together. Thanks to the 4 revolution that we saw brewing in Iran, all these demonstrations, this is the future. These are the kids. This is the women and minorities. In Iraq, massive demonstrations against Iranian and also jihadi control. In Lebanon and other parts of that area, I think the future ultimately is going to be revolutions against the jihadists. It is going to happen. The difference, and I bring it back to us in Washington or to the United States, what is it that we can do to make sure that the peoples of the region who are very frustrated with these extremists and see an option of peace, what is it that we can do to help them? Unfortunately, up till now, this administration seems not to be willing to support these revolts against those two forces. So what American citizens should and can do with lawmakers is to pressure this administration, hopefully next year with a different Congress, perhaps different majority, that we need now to start working with the civil societies of the region, the minorities of the region, the women of the region, because they are the real factor at the end of the day to provoke that change, while we have still an Arab coalition handy and a Abraham Accord also growing.
That's actually fairly positive. And so on that note, I'm going to say thank you very much for enlightening us, bringing together a lot of different streams of things that we see in the media, things we're sure are out there that the media doesn't focus on. But you've brought them together in a way I think that makes us worry, number one, but also understand better the world that we live in. And for that, I thank you very much, Walid Phares. Ladies and gentlemen, remember to go to Dr. Phares's YouTube channel, and you can hear more and read his books. The books are fabulous. Let me tell you, the books are fabulous. So thank you. And thank you to everybody who stayed on well after our normal closing time. Have a good day.
Thank you.